Hi, I'm Larry Goulder, the director of the Stanford Environmental and Energy Policy Analysis Center, also known as SEEPAC. SEEPAC is a joint venture of SIEPR and the Precourt Institute for Energy here at Stanford. We focus on a range of contemporary environmental and energy issues, including the issue of climate change. And I'm here with Charles Kolstad, who's a senior fellow at SEEPAC and SIEPR, also professor by courtesy in Stanford's Department of Economics. Charlie's done a great deal of research on environmental and energy policy issues, including the climate change issue. So I'm going to ask you about your IPCC experience in just a moment, but I actually wanted to start out with a question about the role an economist can play on dealing with the climate change issue. We know that natural scientists, physical scientists have a lot to say about the potential impacts of climate change. But what can an economist contribute on this issue?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. A lot of people wonder that. And the real bottom line is that we understand pretty well the mechanics, the physics, the natural science of the issue. The one thing that we don't understand, and you hear it in the news all the time, is what are the costs of doing something about climate change? What are the costs of not doing something about climate change? And how do those balance? If you think about it, it's actually an economic question nowadays, not a natural science question.
What have you contributed in terms of either looking at the cost of doing something about climate change or the cost of not doing something about climate change?
You mean me personally, or the IPCC? Well, I've looked a lot at the incentives for countries to come together to solve the problem. These agreements, international agreements, where multiple countries agree to take some action, they're a very important part of solving the problem. And the incentives for doing that, the difficulty in bringing those countries together has been really large. So I've been trying to understand how one can break down some of those barriers, what the incentives are to, in fact, bring countries together and actually come together to a solution.
Well, it seems we do need to get the countries to come together. I think the IPCC's recent report says we're losing ground on that dimension, that we only have 10 or 15 years left unless we get the countries together, including developing countries, to really work cohesively, collectively to deal with the problem. We're going to be in trouble. Ottmar Edenhofer, who headed up the IPCC recent report, said if we don't do something in 10 years, we're really sunk. First of all, do you agree with that statement that we have basically 10 years? And if so, what do you think are the prospects for your work and other people's work to actually lead to a collective international agreement?
Well, that's not a conclusion from our work in the IPCC, that we only have 10 years. We did conclude that we can do something about the problem. It will be costly, but we can do something about the problem. And furthermore, that if we wait 10 or 20 years, or 10 or 15 years, it will be more costly to do something about the problem, but not that we can't defer it. That's not a conclusion of our analysis.
Well, if we do defer it, are you suggesting that it won't be a lot more costly, or it will be a lot more costly?
It will be a lot more costly.
But we'd still survive in some sense?
Yeah, we'll survive. We'll survive. At least that's the sense of the knowledge that has been gathered. So to rephrase or to repeat, we can achieve different levels of climate stabilization, which is the term they use, just stabilizing the climate change. It will be costly to society to do it, but it's worth it. And furthermore, if we keep wondering what to do and don't do anything for another 10 or 15 years, it will be more costly when we eventually get around to doing something about it.
What will happen if we don't? If we take more than 10 years?
Well, let me translate what more costly means in physical terms. It means that we'll pay a lot more at the gas pump. It means we'll have to accelerate our efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. It's much easier to do things slowly and gradually than it is to do things quickly. We know that from our everyday life. We know that from lots of realms. And if we have to move quickly, which is what will have to be done in 10 or 20 years, it's going to be more painful for all of us, individuals and for a country and for a world.
Your answers so far have all been in terms of the word if. Are you willing to hazard a prediction as to the likelihood that we're actually going to be able to have a strong international agreement?
Well, I prefer to look at what we've done rather than what the future may bring. I am very doubtful that in the near term we're going to get a strong international agreement.
Why?
I think that we're much more likely to see strong unilateral actions by major countries of the world, like the European Union, thinking of it as a country, the United States, Japan, and even China. China is now a major player, and it's taking that role more seriously. I think it's more likely that we see strong unilateral action as the first step before these countries get together and say, hey, we're all doing similar things. Why don't we put this together into an international agreement and see if we can grow it with others involved? But that's a prediction. You know, who knows what the future may bring. That's what I think will happen.
Let me ask you about the U.S., about the U.S.'s role in this. I know some of your own work and work of many economists has focused on U.S. climate policy. What, in your view, would be the most effective thing that the U.S. can do, even if it's not part of an international agreement? What could the U.S. do to address the climate change issue?
Well, I think there's quite a few things the U.S. can do, and I'm not really saying that Congress will do it, because we all know there are other issues involved in Congress taking action. But there's a lot of bipartisan support for taking gradual steps immediately to address the climate change problem in the U.S. And let me give you a leading example. It's not the only one that could be done. And this actually draws on your own work, Larry, that you've done. But if we were to put in a fee for emissions of carbon, a small one, now or in the next 5 years, and essentially experiment with it, see how it works, make adjustments in it, learn from it, ramp it up slowly over time, we will find ourselves in a much better position in 10 or 20 years than the other case where we do nothing for those 20 years and we say all of a sudden we've got to do something drastic quickly, and that'll be much more difficult for us to do.
Well, as you know, SEEPAC is interested not just in the pure economics, but also in the political dimension, what's politically feasible. And in connection with what you have suggested, it sounds like a price on carbon. There's going to be a lot of political, and there is a lot of political opposition, from consumer groups that are worried about higher energy costs, from industry groups that worry about loss of profits, particularly in the fossil fuel industry. How do you overcome those political obstacles?
Well, I think that one of the lessons we learned from the cap and trade experience from the 1990s with sulfur and in other cap and trade experiences in regions is that political opposition can be assuaged by rebates to particularly injured parties. For instance, if you collect some taxes, you can give the revenue back to people that are hit hard. I don't like to use the term buy off the opposition, but that's effectively what it is. You can address those opposing forces using the revenue you bring in. Because the main point is not to raise revenue. In fact, I would argue that you don't want to raise any revenue. The main point is to send people a signal that carbon is something to conserve on, not to emit quite so much as you used to, if you can do so easily.
Well, as sort of a final question, we'll turn back to the IPCC. You had an important role there in that last meeting. The meeting involved not only the scientists, the leading scientists, including yourself, that contributed to the report, to the original reports, but also representatives of over 120 countries of the world. What do you think was the key message that came from that report, and would you endorse that? Well, I guess you have to endorse it, but to what extent are you comfortable with that message?
Well, we could talk about the process in Berlin, which was an eye-opening experience. But in terms of the key message, I think this circles back to where we started this conversation. The key message is that we can fix the climate change problem, so to speak. We can stabilize the climate at any level we choose, as long as it's fairly high. It will be costly, but we can do it. And a secondary conclusion.
So we can do it without enormous cost, is what you're saying.
But it depends on what level we want to stabilize it at. If we want to stabilize it at 2 degrees, which is what a lot of people talk
2 degrees
about.
Celsius.
2 degrees Celsius, which is almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit. That will be almost impossible to do, very costly. But if we do it at 4 degrees Celsius, which is 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit, then that will be a lot easier. So it's a question of economics and other social sciences as to what balance we achieve between the benefits of stabilization and the cost of doing so, where we come out in that balancing.
Thanks very much for your insights.